Hello everyone. Recently, upon the recommendation of one of my viewers, I read Valentin Lebedev's book, Diary of a Cosmonaut, 211 Days in Space. Who is Valentin Lebedev? Twice a hero of the Soviet Union, he graduated from Moscow Aviation Institute in 1966, worked for a while on the design of spacecraft, then joined the Cosmonaut Corps and flew into space twice. The first time was in 1973 with Pyotr Klimuk on Soyuz 13. The mission lasted 8 days. The second time, 9 years later, in 1982, he flew with Anatoly Berezovoy on Soyuz T-5 to the Salyut 7 space station. The mission lasted 211 days, a record at that time. During this mission, and for some time before and after it, he kept a diary, which became the basis for this book and was published in separate chapters in 1984. Today, I want to focus on some interesting moments from this diary. This was Valentin Lebedev's second mission, meaning he was a relatively experienced cosmonaut who had already flown once. As we know, cosmonauts are selected not just for their ability to remain calm and collected but for their extreme resilience and ability to make quick decisions in the most critical situations. Despite all this, Lebedev's diary is full of various anxieties and concerns on a wide range of topics. He starts with some abstract themes, like world peace, and then moves on to his thoughts on human communication in general, communication within space crews, and psychological compatibility, which he considers very important and something that needs to be taken into account for longer future missions to other planets. But naturally, his greatest concerns are about the upcoming mission, whether he will be able to handle the tasks assigned to him. The most anxiety-provoking event for him on this mission is the upcoming spacewalk. I want to dwell on this moment in more detail. While reading this diary, I was greatly surprised to learn that, as of 1982, in the 17 years since the first spacewalk, only 9 Soviet cosmonauts had performed EVA. The first was Leonov in 1965, then a 4-year break, and in 1969, Yeliseyev and Krenov carried out EVA. They spacewalked from Soyuz 4 to Soyuz 5. This was necessary to test one of the elements of the then still ongoing Soviet moon program. To save on payload, no connecting tunnel was provided in the docking unit between the orbital spacecraft and the lunar module. Therefore, to transfer from the orbital lunar spacecraft, the prototype of Soyuz, to the lunar module, the cosmonauts had to spacewalk. After the cancellation of the Soviet moon program, testing these phases of the project was no longer necessary, leading to a break for 8 long years. The next 3 spacewalks were made from the Salyut 6 space station. In 1977, cosmonauts Romanenko and Grechko performed a spacewalk. In 1978, it was Ivanchenkov and Kovalyonik, and in 1979, Lyahev and Ryumin. Then, there was another 3-year break, and in 1982, Lebedev and Berezovoy performed a spacewalk. Why were there such long breaks between spacewalks? After all, spaceflights continued during this period. There were no long gaps between missions. Was Soviet technology so reliable that it didn't need repairs that could or had to be done in outer space? Probably not. Were Soviet scientists uninterested in experiments that could be conducted in outer space, such as taking equipment out there? That also seems unlikely. In my opinion, these long intervals were due to the fact that spacewalking was very complex, responsible, and most importantly, dangerous activity, involving a risk to the lives of the cosmonauts. Therefore, these potential risks probably outweighed the value of possible experiments that could be conducted in space. Consequently, spacewalks were prepared for very carefully. People were trained for many years. Suitable spacesuits had to be created, airlocks on space stations or craft had to be developed, and so on. On the other hand, the Americans performed around 26 spacewalks in less than 9 years from 1965 to 1974. Some of them did this 2 to 3 times per mission, including moonwalks. For them, it was an absolutely easy, effortless, routine situation, like going to the fridge for food at night. Open the door and voila, step out, do what you need to do, and return to the spacecraft without any airlocks. Again, regarding spacesuits for spacewalks, Alexei Leonov performed EVA in the Berkut spacesuit. It was deemed unsuccessful because, as is well known, during Leonov's spacewalk, the suit inflated like a balloon. The suit was soft and internal pressure caused it to swell, so it was never used again. Krenov and Yeliseyev spacewalked in Yastreb suits. These suits apparently had some reinforcing elements inside to prevent them from swelling as much, but they too were not used again. It took 8 long years to create the Orlan spacesuit, which was first used for spacewalks in 1977 on the Salyut 6 space station and subsequent missions. This same suit, with modifications, is still used for spacewalks today. Sure, over the years, it has undergone several modifications. Its weight has increased from 74 to 114 kilograms, and its autonomy has increased from 5 to almost 10 hours. But essentially, it is the same suit that was created in 1977. This speaks volumes about successful engineering or design solutions that are used for many decades and are maximized to their full potential. Let's compare this situation with the American one. What about their spacesuits? In the Gemini program, they carried out spacewalks, perhaps it is more accurate to say, allegedly carried out spacewalks, in soft suits that inflated from the inside. Then, in the Apollo program, they created what seemed to be a very successful suit, the A7LB, which Nikolai Kamanin admired. He said, "How light and convenient it is. The Americans walk on the moon in it. It allows them to bend, perform any work, and so on." Essentially, in this same suit, but without the life support system backpack, they allegedly spacewalked from the Skylab station as well. And what happened to this suit? Like the entire Apollo program and everything associated with it, after the Skylab project ended, it was promptly forgotten in 1974. That same year, 1974, they began developing a new suit for spacewalks from the shuttle. 18 of these suits were created. Why do I phrase it this way? Because these were not modifications of suits that had been improving over the years. It was the same suit created in 18 copies. Now, of these 18, the last 4 remaining are used on the ISS. 4 burned up with Challenger and Columbia, and the rest wore out and were decommissioned. The Soviet Orlan suit is universal and one size fits all, suitable for any person. The only individual element that is customized for each cosmonaut and brought from Earth, if they need to spacewalk, is the gloves. The Orlan has a semi-rigid, cuirass-like design. It includes a rear hatch entry through the backpack that allows it to be donned by everyone. American spacesuits can also be described as semi-rigid but consist of 2 halves, upper and lower. They are connected at the waist by a special bearing. They used to come in several sizes, from super small to super large. Currently, there are 2 medium-sized suits and 2 very large ones left. Therefore, if a petite American astronaut needs to go into space, there are problems, and sometimes they have to use the Russian Orlan suit. Interestingly, the gloves on American suits, or rather the attachment of the gloves using hinges, were designed by a Soviet engineer from the Zvezda firm back in the late 1980s. To this day, the Americans use these hinges, which are practically identical to those on the Orlan suit. Soviet cosmonauts view the American suit with some skepticism. Firstly, it is 30 kilograms heavier than the Russian Orlan, weighing 145 kilograms compared to 114 kilograms. This is because our engineers created aluminum bearings, significantly reducing the weight, while the Americans used stainless steel bearings. They did not economize on weight. Additionally, the pressure in our suit is slightly higher than in the American one, 0.4 atmospheres. This makes it comfortable to be in, but difficult to move because it is more inflated. However, for our cosmonauts, this is not a significant problem because the tools for working in space are designed to be gripped roughly, with no need for fine motor skills, making it quite comfortable for our cosmonauts to work. The pressure in the American spacesuit is lower, 0.3 atmospheres. Therefore, it seems a bit easier to move in it, but it has stiffer, more tightly fitting gloves. Because of this, it would seem that performing fine motor movements would be easier. However, it is actually more difficult, because, first, bending these stiff gloves is hard, and second, American astronauts constantly freeze in such stiff gloves. By the way, what about the American lunar spacesuit? They seem to be planning to return to the moon, but at the moment they don't have a lunar spacesuit.
And why is that?
Some of my opponents and others say that priorities have changed, that now no one will go to the moon just to plant a flag.
They'll go there to work, so a new suit is needed. Wait a minute, what difference does it make what you do on the moon? Take photos with a flag or drill in search of water.
By the way, astronauts were already drilling 50 years ago and managed perfectly well in those suits. Despite the suits being designed for 7 hours of work, in the last missions they spent even up to 7.5 hours in them. Currently, the absolute record for being in a spacesuit belongs to American Susan Helms.
She spent almost 9 hours in a suit, 8 hours and 56 minutes.
This record was set back in 2001.
Actually, 7 to 8 hours in a spacesuit is a full working day. More than that is not really necessary.
A person will get tired and need to drink, eat, and rest. So, the autonomy of the suit beyond 8 to 9 hours is not particularly needed. Secondly, the A7LB suit, it seems, protected astronauts from radiation perfectly well. Many of them lived well into their 80s, and some are still alive, even over 90. So, they have no signs of radiation sickness.
This means the suit is quite suitable for further use. However, it is now considered too immobile because of the hip joint hinges and so on.
Yet 50 years ago, astronauts moved perfectly well in it and handled all kinds of work. Now they are talking about creating a very mobile suit weighing almost 170 kilograms.
This is about the continuity of technology and successful engineering solutions. Returning to Lebedev's diary.
Not only did they prepare for the spacewalk for several years on Earth, but they also prepared for almost 3 days on the Salyut 7 station itself.
They practiced putting on the suits and checked them for airtightness.
Here Lebedev again discovered with surprise that putting on a suit in zero gravity is much more difficult than on Earth. This is despite the fact that the Orlan doesn't need to be put on. You just climb into it, which is somewhat easier.
Nevertheless, it is still more difficult to do in zero gravity.
Again, let's recall the American astronauts, who climbed into their suits not in spacious stations, except for Skylab, but in the tighter command modules of the Apollo spacecraft or even tighter lunar modules, practically phone booths.
Nevertheless, they managed it perfectly well.
After this, our cosmonauts Lebedev and Berezovoy checked their suits for airtightness.
Lebedev's suit leaked, and its pressure dropped quickly. The cause was a strap caught in the door of the hatch through which one enters the suit.
Generally, this door is completely airtight, fitting tightly to the edge of the suit's entry opening. There are rubber inserts, and it is pressed shut by a lever. One would think that a thin strap caught in this gap wouldn't break the airtight seal, but nevertheless, it did. How is airtightness ensured in the A7LB suit? It turns out it was done with a double brass zipper with some rubber inserts, which are not even very visible in photographs. After all these preparatory works, the day of the spacewalk finally arrived.
The cosmonauts exited, of course, through the airlock.
This is a relatively small compartment with nothing unnecessary in it.
Nothing is stored there, no food, no items needed for the mission, and so on.
Why do I emphasize this? Because Lebedev writes, after we depressurized the airlock and opened the exit hatch, everything in the airlock was sucked into outer space like into a big vacuum cleaner.
First, a huge cloud of golden dust flew out of the airlock into space.
Then, a pencil that had been lost some time ago, apparently sucked up by a fan, flew out.
And some small items, a few bolts and nuts.
This is a very apt comparison to a huge vacuum cleaner that sucks everything out of the airlock. Because space vacuum is indeed a big vacuum cleaner. Again, this all happened in the airlock, where there is nothing unnecessary. How did American astronauts get out of their craft? They had no airlocks.
They depressurized the entire spacecraft.
Consequently, everything that wasn't secured, any pens, notebooks, possibly food packets, small items, razors, anything, would have been sucked into space.
And, of course, dust.
But apparently, the astronauts had no dust, presumably because they regularly conducted wet cleaning.
So, what was sucked out into space for the Americans? Only one well-documented case is known, which occurred during Edward White's first spacewalk from Gemini 4.
As is known, during this spacewalk, some lone, unmatched, apparently unnecessary glove flew out of the Gemini. It didn't fly out immediately after the hatch was opened but lay there for a while, pondering whether to fly out or not.
Finally, it flew out with some acceleration, hit the hatch, and flew into space. I haven't been able to find any mentions of dust or small items sucked into space in the astronauts' recollections. Lebedev then describes his experience and emotions from the spacewalk. He writes about the black void, the blue earth beneath his feet, and so on. He then describes the following episode.
It is not entirely clear whether he meant the cosmonauts who had gone on a spacewalk or just observed the Earth from the station, but he writes the following. In the memories of some cosmonauts, I read that they supposedly saw trucks, buses on the roads down there, and things like that. But this can't be because from a height of 350 kilometers, at which the station orbits Earth, one can see objects no smaller than 100 meters.
Seeing buses, trucks, or distinguishing a bus from a truck from such a height is impossible. I wonder who this potshot is taken at? I know only two people who became famous for such similar recollections about trucks and buses.
One of them is Scott Carpenter, who flew on Mercury and supposedly saw trucks driving on the roads of Tibet. However, this was considered his hallucination, attributed to some euphoria he experienced from the spaceflight. The second such person was Alexei Leonov, who saw some school buses when flying over the USA, which scared the Americans. To put Alexei Leonov in a bad light in 1982 would have been, to say the least, odd. Again, at that time, Leonov was Lebedev's immediate superior, and he communicated with him directly. Therefore, if he meant Leonov's memories or conversations, he probably could have just said that he had heard similar recollections from some cosmonauts. Again, I don't know if Leonov had written any of his memoirs by 1982. I think he did it a bit later.
In general, in my opinion, more likely he took a dig at the American astronauts and their recollections. But I do not rule out that he might have meant Leonov as well. Next, Lebedev describes his concerns about the photographic equipment and how it would perform in outer space. He worried about whether it would overheat, whether the emulsion would melt, whether the film would fuse to the camera mechanisms, and whether it would advance properly, and so on.
He expresses these concerns despite the fact that, firstly, all the photographic equipment was in thermal cases.
And secondly, one orbit around the Earth lasts about 90 minutes.
Accordingly, for half of this time, the station or spacecraft is in the shade, and for the other half, it is in the sunlight.
So, the heating of the equipment lasted no more than 40 to 45 minutes. Nevertheless, Lebedev was troubled by this issue. In contrast, the Americans were on the Moon for up to 7 hours during later missions. On the Moon, there are no clouds to block the sun, and there is no shade.
The only thing that protected the cameras was the white paint applied to them. There were no protective cases. However, during 7 hours of direct exposure to the sun, when the surface of the spacesuits heated up to 180 degrees Fahrenheit, nothing happened to the film.
And we got excellent photos without any defects.
After completing their tasks in outer space, Berezovoy and Lebedev returned to the Salyut 7 station.
The next day was designated for sleep and rest. Lebedev then makes several remarks in his diary about weightlessness. Firstly, he notes that in 0G, one cannot swim like in a pool.
The Baron von Munchausen method, saving himself from drowning by hoisting himself up by his pigtail, won't work here.
You will flounder in the air, but you'll stay in one place.
You can only either rotate around your own axes or push off from something. Pushing off must be done gently and very carefully, because if you overdo it, you'll crash headfirst into a wall, an instrument, or a colleague. Secondly, Lebedev complains about the constant disorientation in zero gravity because there is no concept of up, down, floor, or ceiling.
On Earth, entering the same rooms repeatedly, we quickly adapt.
But here, just when you've gotten used to the layout of everything on the station, you float away for an hour or two to do some experiments or unload a cargo ship. You come back at a different angle and everything is upside down again.
You have to readapt,
which heavily strains the vestibular system.
Lebedev also describes frequent headaches caused by the accumulation of blood and lymph in the head.
The only thing that helps is daily physical exercise to encourage the blood and lymph to flow down to the legs. By the way, regarding legs, in less than 3 months in low Earth orbit, the circumference of Lebedev's calves decreased by as much as 6 centimeters.
On Earth, such a reduction in calf size is only possible in bedridden patients with complete immobility and a deficit of nutrition. Here, we have a seemingly healthy man who regularly engages in physical exercises, yet his calves shrank by 6 centimeters.
This is mostly due not so much to muscle atrophy but to the fluid shifting to the upper part of the body. Another interesting aspect of 0G. Let's look at Anatoly Berezovoy's hairstyle on Earth and on the Salyut 7 station.
In zero gravity, his neatly styled hair turned into a spiky mess. In general, all modern astronauts with somewhat longer hair feature similar spiky hairdos in zero gravity. What about the Americans? For the most part, either bald Americans went into space, or those with relatively short haircuts. However, there were 2 notable goofs. These shots are from Apollo 17, returning from the Moon to Earth. Here we see that Cernun's hair is neatly styled. The collar of his suit seems to be sticking up. Flashlights are floating around. Some food tubes simulate 0G, but his hair remains completely undisturbed. The second blunder was with Owen Garriott, who flew to the Skylab space station during the second mission. His hair was even longer, but despite spinning in his chair, doing physical exercises, and performing somersaults, his hairstyle also remained intact. In my opinion, these blunders were only possible in relatively late missions. Cernan flew on Apollo 17, which was the last lunar Apollo mission.
Before that, he went on Apollo 10, but it wasn't as noticeable there.
And Garriott was on Skylab after all.
Naturally, interest in these missions was already much lower than in the first lunar or pre-lunar Apollo missions. Therefore, it seems the directors of these missions allowed such blunders. Before this, such bloopers did not occur, and we usually saw either bald astronauts, those with short haircuts, or wearing caps where it was hard to see their hairstyle.
Moving on to physical exercises, Lebedev writes that during physical exercises, you get covered in sweat.
And in zero gravity, the sweat doesn't flow away or evaporate. It stays floating around like a jellyfish on your forehead. This immediately reminded me of two American astronauts from the last Skylab mission, Gerald Carr and William Pogue, who grew full beards in less than 3 months.
I think beard wearers will agree with me that any beard requires maintenance. For example, food particles can get stuck in it, but on Earth, only food that has fallen from your own mouth can get stuck. In zero gravity, however, anything can get caught in the beard. This can include crumbs dropped by your companion and dust, which flies everywhere and will also settle in the beard. Now, let's recall the sweaty jellyfish that forms during physical exercises. Let me remind you that despite 2 heat shields, the temperature on Skylab was no less than 82 degrees Fahrenheit, possibly higher. Plus, they also did physical exercise.
Extracting that sweaty jellyfish from a beard would be quite a task.
Taking a full shower like on Earth wasn't possible.
You could only wipe yourself down with wet wipes. So, there was a high probability that Pogue and Carr would return from real space covered in pimples with some sort of skin irritation. However, they came back with neatly groomed beards, as if they had just come from a barbershop. Again, during their mission, they made 4 spacewalks. Such a beard could interfere with putting on a helmet, for example, by trapping hairs.
But nevertheless, it apparently didn't bother them. As far as I know, bearded astronauts were not seen on the ISS or earlier on the shuttles.
Additionally, the Americans boasted about inventing various razors. Initially, there was a safety razor with a vacuum-like device to suck up the stubble. Then they invented a battery-powered electric razor. Yet, these two grew beards during the flight. The stay of Lebedev and Berezovoy on the station was extended several times. Initially, it was thought they would stay for about 90 days, but later, considering their good health, the mission was extended to 211 days. For this, a Progress cargo spacecraft had to be sent to orbit with food, water, some scientific equipment, and fuel for the station. This cargo shuttle had to dock at the aft docking port of the Salyut 7 station to refuel the station. However, this docking port was occupied by the Salyut T-7 spacecraft, which brought the second short-term visiting crew. That is, Lebedev and Berezovoy were the long-term resident crew, and Leonid Popov, Alexander Serebrov, and Svetlana Savitskaya arrived on the Salyut T-7. They stayed on the station for about a week, then returned to Earth on the Salyut T-5 spacecraft, which was nearing the end of its design life.
Consequently, Berezovoy and Lebedev would later return to Earth on the Salyut T-7. This Salyut T-7 spacecraft had to be reparked, so to speak, to the forward docking port of the Salyut 7 station. This was the first redocking in the history of Soviet space program. The procedure was so complex and crucial that they prepared for it for several days. What did the preparation involve? First, the station was almost completely shut down. Second, the results and scientific data of all the completed experiments were moved to the Salyut spacecraft.
This was done just in case the redocking failed, so Lebedev and Berezovoi could simply return to Earth on this spacecraft.
The redocking was successful and was carried out in a semi-automatic mode.
Both the spacecraft and the station maneuvered, all under ground control, with the help of tracking stations, and everything went smoothly. But to reiterate, the redocking was such a critical and complex procedure that the cosmonauts were given a day off to rest afterward. There were even jokes at the Mission Control Center that this redocking would be counted as another mission. It's worth noting that in the early 1970s, the Americans performed redocking maneuvers both in low Earth orbit and lunar orbit quite effortlessly. Again, redocking now and then in low Earth orbit occurs at the orbiting velocity, approximately 7.9 kilometers per second.
The Americans, however, performed redocking maneuvers at the escape velocity.
After translunar injection, when the third stage of the Saturn V rocket accelerated the Apollo stack towards the Moon, Command Service Module undocked from it, turned 180 degrees, docked with the lunar module, pulled it out of the Saturn V third stage, and continued its journey to the Moon.
In lunar orbit, they docked at the Moon orbital velocity of 2.8 kilometers per second.
However, there are no tracking stations on the Moon, so who controlled them and how they located themselves in lunar orbit remains an open question. Apparently, they managed on their own without any tracking stations. Additionally, on the ISS, spacecraft sometimes have to be relocated from one docking port to another. An American astronaut was once trusted to relocate a Salyut spacecraft. In an interview, he spoke about this with excitement, saying how thrilled he was to participate in this relocation and what unforgettable experiences it brought.
Even today, relocation is such a non-trivial event that some cosmonauts and astronauts, throughout their entire careers, have not only never participated in a relocation but have never even observed one while on the ISS. To reiterate, 50 years ago, the Americans performed these relocations at a blink of an eye.
After flying for 211 days, Berezovoi and Lebedev successfully landed in the Kazakh steppe on December 10, 1982. This part of the diary contains some of the most interesting recollections.
Lebedev describes his sensations after landing.
They landed shortly before dark, making it impossible to evacuate them to Baikonur or Zhezkazgan on the same day, so they spent the night right at the landing site in a specially prepared mobile home. Lebedev lies on a flat bunk in the mobile home and says that it feels as if he is lying in a 2G centrifuge. His back is simply flattened against the bunk, turning onto his side is very difficult, and bending his arm is like doing an exercise with a 2 to 3 kilogram dumbbell.
The next day, they were carried to the descent module for a photo op.
Despite the short distance, they still couldn't walk on their own the next day. After that, they were transported first to Baikonur and then to Moscow, and Lebedev took his first walk only on the fourth day after landing.
It was 300 meters long.
Lebedev writes that he couldn't stand for more than 5 minutes, covered in sweat, feeling extreme weakness and fatigue.
His next walk lasted 40 minutes but only on the 9th day after returning to Earth.
This was despite daily exercises on an exercise bike, treadmill, wearing compression garments, and so on.
Some might argue, they flew for 211 days. That's not just a week or two on the Apollo.
Yes, but I'm not comparing it to a week-long Apollo mission. I'm comparing it to the spry astronauts returning from Skylab, who flew for 2 to 3 months.
The condition of a person who has been in zero gravity for 2 to 3 months or 6 months does not differ significantly.
The condition of a person who has been in space for a week, maybe 2, differs greatly. However, let's look at the footage of the first Kazakh cosmonaut immediately after re-entry, who spent only 10 days in 0G. As we can see, his condition isn't much different from his comrade who spent 135 days in space.
Such is the fascinating diary of a real cosmonaut.
I recommend it to everyone for reading. As they say, feel the difference. Find 10 differences between the memories of a person who went on a real space mission and the memories of American astronauts from 50 years ago.
As always, I await your comments, additions, or objections on my channel.
That's all for today.
See you next time.